At the moment, it is Monday morning, and on Friday, there's an open test day at Buttonwillow, so with any luck, I'd like to have the 244 GTK out on track for the first time in like a year and a half. To get that done, I've got to do quite a bit of wiring, which I know how to do, but I'm learning some new stuff as I go. We've got to get this water neck on the car, but I got to modify it first. We've got to fill the whole system up. We've got to nut and bolt the entire thing. We've got to make sure all these new systems work. Got to get the air actuators working for the shifter. There's a lot of work to do. I don't even know if there's enough time to do it, but I want to try. So let's see how far we get. Now, in the last episode, we were in the middle of two installs. One is a VBox HD2 camera and data logging system, while the other is an air shift setup from ShiftTech. Both of these have their own wiring that needs to be installed so that everything can interface properly, and both of these systems need to interact with our Nexus R5 ECU. We're going to get there later in the episode, but first, I want to focus on a much more pressing issue, which is our cooling system. Our swap to a K20 cylinder head requires a revision of how the cooling system mates to it, and that brings us to this track-tough water neck, which I want to install. However, there's one problem with this thing, and it's not Rob's fault. He built this exactly like I asked him to, but this fitting, it does not clear my throttle body, because my throttle body is not where a normal throttle body would go, so we've got to do some reorganizing, and I feel so bad because Rob is, as you can tell, an incredible welder, and I'm going to butcher this part. It ain't going to look this good when I'm done. I'm sorry, Rob. We're going to take this, we're going to cut this off, we're going to pitch it down just a bit, we'll put a new one on, and that should be all it needs. I really just need to kick this down the slightest bit so that it clears the throttle body. And then we'll remake our hose so that it fits now, and then fill it up and fire it up, I guess. I don't know. I dug around the scrap bin and found an 1.5-inch piece of tubing with an appropriate amount of bend in it for us to use. The only downside is that this is bigger in diameter than the 1.25-inch tubing that Rob used on the original part. I called all around town trying to find some 1.25-inch tubing, but I couldn't find anything at all, so I'm just going to try to make this work. We're going to cut off the original fitting, slide this over, and simply weld the gap and hope for the best. There's no reason that it shouldn't work, but it might not be the most elegant solution, but this is a race car, and we're trying to go racing. Surprisingly, but perhaps just due to my lack of expertise, some of this weld was actually quite challenging, especially on the inside where the tubing meets the actual main chamber of the filler neck and swirl pod. Getting in there and closing up the gap proved to be quite difficult, but after fussing with it for quite a while and losing my temper a bit, I did get the job done. Is it pretty? No, not really, but all the things that you can see in the engine bay look good enough. And it holds water pressure, and that's what we need in this case. Installing it, also a little bit tricky as it doesn't fit with much room to spare and it's hard to get to the bolts, but these are details that don't really matter once it's installed. The final piece to our cooling system puzzle is to make a new hose that goes from this port we just changed to the bulkhead on the firewall. This was previously accomplished with a -20 AN line, and that can still be used, but we've got to change the length because the port has moved in position. Now there is one downside at hand, and that's that it's a straight shot from the fitting we just modified to the bulkhead fitting on the firewall. This AN line has no bends in it, and that means getting it on and installed and getting those fittings threaded into place is a real son of a gun. It's the nasty side of AN fittings, especially with big lines like this. I'm hopeful Dime PSI can work with me to come up with a solution that's a bit more serviceable in the future, but for the time being, this is going to work, and again, it holds pressure, and that's what I'm focused on at the moment. With this, the cooling system's finally done, the engine can run for an extended period of time, but there are other things that we have to accomplish. In the last episode, I made this bracket to support the pneumatic shift servo for our shift tech system. And it works, but honestly, I have some concerns that it might not hold up to the rigors of racing, so I'd like to remake it out of this, a solid chunk of aluminum. The tricky part is, I don't have a mill or really any of the proper equipment in order to build this, other than a bandsaw and a belt grinder. But I want to give it my best effort and see what we can pull off. It seems like a fun adventure. Now you'll probably notice this does not fit within the confines of this block in any direction. Thing is, these upper holes up here aren't necessary. We're using the lower ones, and that just about fits. Technically, if I move them down just a touch, it'll clear, and the height of this hole isn't important to how it works, so we're gonna do a little bit of reorganizing. The main thing is we gotta get these 4 mounting holes put into the part, and then we've gotta have a provision here to hold the servo. So, without any further ado, I guess, I don't know what I'm doing. We're gonna drill some holes first. I think let's get the mounting holes drilled. I'm the worst at drilling holes. If this goes terribly, at least we know from the beginning that it's not going to work. I ruin the aluminum and we toss this entire episode out. Let's drill 4 holes, make sure that it bolts to the transmission, and then we'll start removing material and making the rest of this part. I've never really made a part like this before. This is my first endeavor making something out of a solid chunk of metal, but I figure I've seen other people do it, and if they can do it, I can learn to do it too, even if we mess some stuff up along the way. Again, I don't need it to be perfect, I just need it to work, and that starts by being able to bolt it to the gearbox. I'm thinking this is probably a really good use of the mag vise, as we'll call it. Haven't really gotten a chance to utilize this thing yet. It seems like what it was meant for. It needs to be cleaned up, but am I somebody that's gonna clean it up? No. Now, I am not a machinist, not even close, so every one of you out there that's watching me do this and thinking, oh my God, this is just a disaster, that's fine. I get it. It is. But we're trying. Gotta learn somehow. So, using the drill press that my buddy Ethan donated to the shop, I want to get these 4 holes drilled, and I'm going to go on and drill them exactly to size at 8mm each. Now, I can identify my first issue right away, and that's that this block isn't actually square, and I didn't bother to check that either. So, although my holes look reasonably good from here, once I got this whole project done, I realized they weren't all that accurate, but they're still accurate enough to bolt up, and that's what counts. My tip to you, if you're going to do this, is make sure your block is square to start with, or at least do your best to square it by eye, because this one is way out. That is 4 holes in a piece of aluminum, and let me tell you, it's 4 more holes than there were before, and if that's not progress, I don't know what is. Hey, they actually line up pretty good. I don't know if you guys can see that, but this is pretty not bad. Pretty good. Gonna do some cutting now. Okay, now to the bandsaw. To the bandsaw. This block of aluminum is quite a bit too wide, so I want to run the saw down the entire length of it, and that seems easy on the surface, but unfortunately my bandsaw isn't all that, so this process was really slow going. During my first cut, I should have remembered that my bandsaw does have a speed variable gearbox on it, and it would have helped, but I completely forgot about that. I don't think I've ever actually adjusted it, so instead of waiting here for hours, I came up with a different plan. All right, I've been cutting for minutes, and this is going to literally take all day, so let's take this over to Les and Brett's and run it in there. Roll in bandsaw, let it cut it real quick, and then continue with what we're doing. I agree that this is kind of cheating by going somewhere else to use their tools, especially given that it's a machine shop and we could then just mill this whole thing, but I do want to accomplish this with all of the tools that I do have on hand, minus this one cut. Okay, like this?
Yep, and then you kind of catch that one under that one.
Whoa! Looks like I know what I'm doing.
There you go.
Ta-da. Yep. All right, where's that go?
There you go.
I'm not bleeding.
Yeah, right.
And I wasn't any more elegant unfolding the new blade, but we got it done, and now we are finally ready to cut some aluminum. Now, it's not really the saw that's making the difference here, it's the blade, and that's why we changed it. The blade on my saw back at my shop is meant for cutting things like stainless and has really small teeth on it, versus this one's much more aggressive teeth that are suited for cutting through aluminum like this, meaning we got the job done in a couple of minutes. With the block cut down and back at our shop across the street, we're back to drilling more holes, this time a massive one to start giving shape to what we need. This one represents the bottom of the fork if we're comparing it to the old part. Unfortunately, that does mean now I have to cut through this block several more times, and I'm too stubborn to go back across the street, so we're going to make it work with my bandsaw and adjusting the speed. It was at this point I started wondering if I'm just making a mess of a block of aluminum instead of making a part I'm actually going to be willing to bolt onto my car, but we're this far in, I figure as long as I put in the effort, it's gotta turn out alright. I think. I mentioned when we started making this part that I should have squared the block up, and you can see after drawing some lines on it just how out of square it is, so we need to get it shaped up on the belt sander, but first I want to drill one more really big hole in it, and that means there's no going back. So we're starting to get somewhere. Hopefully you can kind of tell what I'm after here. There's a few things at play. I'm just trying to decide how I can make it as robust as possible, how I make it look okay. I mean, it just needs to function for the time being. Theoretically, we could almost just put long bolts through the top of this thing, one through the side, and call it done, but we're not going to do that. So I think we're just going to keep shaping it for the time being, see what we can make happen. This project was a lot of back and forth between drilling holes and then cutting it on the bandsaw. I had to make sure I wasn't going to make any irreversible decisions or cut off part of this thing that I needed in the future, but I wanted to reduce it down to the minimum amount of metal needed to make a strong part that also looked halfway decent. Perhaps the most challenging part of any of this was the fact that the blade on my bandsaw cutting through material this thick wants to walk around, and that means the inside faces of this part are far from straight or smooth, so I had to spend a lot of time smoothing them out and trying to make this thing not look like a hack job. With that, it's on to the final hole or pair of holes, the one that's going to hold the rose joint or rod end on the back end of our shift servo. It was really hard not to put this hole in the middle of the part. I wanted it to be symmetric, but the hole has to be a specified distance from our shift fork, so we're going to have an asymmetric part, and we're going to shape it accordingly. For some of these operations, I'm using a disc sander instead of the belt sander, but trust me, our $150 Ryobi belt sander could do this job without much effort. I bought that thing back when we first started building the 244 GTK, and it's still kicking, so I want to give it an acknowledgement. That is one impressive little tool for what it costs, and I got it at Home Depot. Now, I could spend an unlimited amount of time fine-tuning this part, but I've decided to call this the finished point. Minus one important detail, I need to countersink the inner holes, but we'll get there. Otherwise, this part is finished and it's as nice as it needs to be. I'm happy with the outcome, and although there's room for improvement, I think this is plenty good for a race car part. Thankfully, it does fit under the transmission, it bolts up to the servo, and everything lines up exactly the way that it's supposed to. Both ShiftTech and Quaife were adamant that the throw of this servo needs to be dialed in perfectly, within a millimeter of either direction. So we custom machined a spacer to go inside of the servo to nail it. After cycling the transmission through the gears and checking the servo throw, it looks like we are in business, and it's time to move on to wiring this whole system together so that we can actually make it function. All right, now here's what I'm thinking here. I think this is going to work. What I've got on this end is a plug that goes to the one empty port on our Haltech Nexus R5. Do we have to use this one port? No, but it's open. This is going to try to make my life easier. This is normally used to run like extra injectors, it looks like. It's got some pulsed inputs. It's got one CAN bus, and then it runs ignition and a wideband sensor. I'm hopeful, we're going to find out here in a second when I call Andrew, that my choice of wiring here is reconfigurable in a way that will run what we need it to run. We're going to use the inputs for the shifter. We're going to use the CAN for the V-Box system, and then the outputs, which are grounds, to then control different things. Because it says that we can use them as just normal outputs, hopefully. If that doesn't make sense, I don't blame you. Anyways, that's going to go to the Nexus. That's our CAN provision. That's where we're going to plug in the V-Box. And then this plugs into the harness that came with the ShiftTech shift system. And so I've kind of configured all of these wires here to inputs and outputs that I think should be configurable to make the whole system function. This stuff, we're just going to pretend it doesn't exist. And then over here, I'm going to figure out exactly where to set these up, but we've got a 12 volt, a ground, and then a sensor 5 volt. Because I don't think this plug has the ability to give me those things, but we're winging it. So let's call Andrew and find out if this is even going to work. I could be totally off. Now, watching that back here in the edit suite, I'm realizing that was kind of a complicated explanation, so here it is in its simplest terms. I need to hook up my paddles so they tell the computer that it's time to shift. I then need the computer to approve the shift and then tell the solenoid to activate. It's relatively simple as far as wiring goes, but I want to do it properly so it's safe. The observant ones out there might notice the entire inside of this car is black now. I spent the weekend painting it, and it looks so much better. Does it look good? No, because the floor in this car is really ugly, but it looks a lot better than it did. And I should have done this a year ago. What a massive improvement this is for the way the inside of this car feels. Should we shorten this wire? Yeah, probably. Am I going to shorten this wire? No. But you know what? You never know. Maybe you need to access CAN 30 feet from your car. Did you guys ever think about that? You think they ever thought about that, Anthony? I doubt it. See, it's all about having the right foresight here. I figure we can always come back and make changes and improve everything that's here. Right now, I just want to get everything hooked up, connected, and make sure it's functioning correctly. If you watched the last episode, you saw that ShiftTech actually includes a full mil-spec grade harness for this thing that's completely booted and ray-chemmed, and it doesn't require any modification to get this system up and running. The only changes that we're having to make are to interface it with our ECU and to interface it with the V-Box system. Let's talk about why this is so critical. The Nexus R5 ECU has a lot of programming within it called shift strategy. There's a ton of parameters that we can set, which then allows the computer to decide whether or not it's allowed to perform the shift we have requested. An example would be requesting a downshift while at high RPM. If the ECU realizes that we're going to mechanically over-rev the engine by performing the shift, it will delay until it's safe to do so. In the last episode, I borrowed a switch panel from my buddy Ryan over at Rywire, and now we need to get my switches actually mounted and installed. This setup is going to be temporary because I want to redraw this in CAD and send it out to SendCut to be cut out of carbon fiber, but a simple template drawn up in Fusion 360 and then printed out and stuck to metal means we can knock a temporary part out in a matter of minutes. This is silly to say following the fact that we just hand-built an entire shift servo bracket, but it's been a while since I've handmade parts out of aluminum, given that lately I have turned to CAD and laser cutting for all of the parts like this. It's a fresh reminder that with a few $100s worth of fab tools off of Craigslist and a basic understanding of free CAD software like Fusion 360, that you can build pretty much anything. With the wheel and switches installed, along with a battery so we can power everything up, it's time to figure out if everything works. All right. I think everything's all wired up now. Everything's interfaced with the ECU, the PDM. The only thing that's not powered at the moment is the V-Box base itself. I'll get that set up in a minute, but now we need to hop in and make sure that we configure the R5 and the PD16 to send out and receive all the correct signals. So let's find out how we're doing. We did get everything powered up and working, although there were some tables within the Nexus software that needed setting up, so we weren't out of the woods. I had Andrew Molina from Animal Auto come over to help me get the Nexus software programmed appropriately, and while he was there, he insisted we go through and make some wiring revisions. ShiftTech's harness was a bit of a universal solution, and he wanted things to directly integrate into both our ECU and our PDM. Simplicity is important, especially when it comes to diagnosing problems in the future, and he wants to make sure he knows exactly where everything's going and what pin it's tied to through the NSP software. Essentially, we don't want any intermediate connectors, and we definitely don't need a relay to power the compressor for the air system. That's why we have a PDM. Relays are completely unnecessary. After some time, Andrew got everything squared away, and we are ready to head to the dyno. It's hard to believe that this is the first time this car has left the shop since last October. It's collected a lot of dust, and actual tar from our leaking roof has damaged the vinyl beyond repair, so I'm glad we're offering this thing a new livery here in the next few weeks. Geon's going to be an integral part of that because they are a huge new partner with us here on the channel, and you're going to be hearing a lot more about them in some upcoming episodes. But for now, in this moment, they're helping us to get the 244 GTK looking good, clean, and better than ever as it heads off to the dyno. It's probably silly to say at this point, but it feels really good to have this thing moving under its own power once again. And on top of that, it sounds incredible. I mean, just listen to this Turbo Smart Turbo sing. It makes me feel a big sense of confidence hearing how well this car runs, even on just a true bass tune that Andrew put on so we could fire the car up. Obviously, it doesn't have the VTEC killer system or the crazy cams that our previous engine builds had, but it sounds really healthy even at just an idle. I think this should improve drivability even around the pit and paddock. As always, I am trusting Animal Auto with the dyno tuning on this car. Andrew Molina has always taken care of my projects and has really gone out of his way to make sure that they are as safe as possible. I want to run these cars hard, and he's gone above and beyond to make sure we have things like fail-safe set up, a window for a margin of error. I mean, he leaves no stone left unturned and doesn't cut any corners, and that's why we're back once again. But on the note of once again, I know we've already had a number of 244 GTK dyno episodes, so I want to approach this one a little bit differently. Instead of just showcasing how the entire thing went, let's talk about the problems that we encountered and how we knocked them out. First on the list was swapping our fuel injectors from 1750s down to 1300s. We're not aiming for 1,000 horsepower anymore, and because this engine is a lot more tame, we can run a smaller injector and get a lot more tunability out of it. Up next, we realized one of our air temp sensors had a crack in it, and while that doesn't mean it would fail, I probably over-tightened it at some point, and we figured, we're here, let's get it solved and replaced. Luckily, I had a spare in the trailer, so this was a very simple fix. We also had to change a coolant temp sensor, but the real hurdle that we faced was once we realized we had a boost leak. It was tough to decide exactly where it was coming from because spraying soapy water wasn't all that revealing. We thought at first that it might just be a loose blow-off valve, but tightening it down didn't really fix anything. There was a lot of back and forth before admitting that we're going to have to pull the charge pipe that connects the intercooler to the throttle body to really diagnose the issue. You see, we changed from a K24 to a K20, and with that comes a 19mm drop in the cylinder head height. Now, my charge piping is connected with Vibrant HD clamps, which have flexibility and adjustment to them, but the problem is we reached the limit of that adjustment. I was hopeful maybe it was just damaged O-rings, and I tried replacing them to no avail. We also pulled the throttle body and replaced the paper gaskets I had made a couple of years ago with RTV sealant, but despite improving things the tiniest bit, this did not solve the problem. The truth is, I'm going to have a fabrication project on my hands once I get back to the shop, but the fix at the moment here at the dyno was to get out some old-fashioned silicone couplers and to slide them over the provisions for those HD clamps. Essentially, we're looking for a way to take up the misalignment in the charge piping and seal everything up tightly. We could probably send this down the track in this configuration if we wanted to, but this doesn't feel race ready to me. It's a dyno fix that I'm going to come back and solve next week. But with the boost leak figured out and solved, the engine is happy and it sounds like we are finally ready to fill this thing up with fuel and begin the break-in process. We need to let this engine come up to temp for quite some time. We want everything to set properly, and then we'll begin introducing new varying loads to the engine. With the initial break-in process completed comes an oil change, and that's where our friends at Pennzoil come into play. As with all of our projects, we're running Pennzoil Platinum Full Synthetic Oil. This stuff is designed for high-performance turbocharged engines just like this one, and I can count on it to take care of what's going on inside of our K20. Importantly, I want to actually look at the oil following the break-in process and see what things look like. Honestly, this stuff looks really good. There's like no particulate anywhere in here. I don't see any bearing material. Engine seems super happy. I mean, we're going to see the tiniest bit of kind of almost just metallic pearlescent in the oil because it's freshly broken in. We just ran this engine hard for the first time ever, but this is exactly what we want to see on a fresh engine break-in. I couldn't be happier with it. I feel really good about the health of the engine and honestly, sending it once we get on track. And with things looking good, then comes the monumental refill of 15 more quarts of Pennzoil Platinum Full Synthetic. Given that this is the fourth engine I've put into this car at this point, I want to make sure that it lasts, so thanks again to our friends at Pennzoil for taking care of the inside of this engine to the same extent we're taking care of the outside. Now, with our oil changed and everything dialed in, it's time to actually start spinning this thing up on the dyno and making power. But there is one final hurdle to clear, and that's that the data is showing some oddities when it comes to fuel pressure. We're currently reading fuel pressure from the fuel pressure regulator, which is mounted to the firewall after the fuel rail. And if you look here, you'll see it dip at the last second. Right there. We want to make sure that there is no fuel pressure loss, but this could be just based on where we're reading it from. So we're adding a second sensor to the fuel rail itself and collecting more data. Andrew is all about data acquisition, double and triple checking everything, and making sure we have redundancies for anything that could lead to failure. Everything is checking out, and the engine sounds incredibly healthy. Major kudos to RS Machine once again. Now let's find out what this engine's actually going to make. Now again, we're aiming for conservative numbers this time around, something reliable that will stay together, and I'm happy to say that at 17 psi, hardly breaking a sweat, our K20 pumps out an impressive 535 horsepower at the rear wheels. Power comes on way sooner too, and needless to say, I am beyond excited. So the dyno is finished and the car is making great power. I feel really good about it. All that's really left on this thing is to finalize our shift strategy, which has to be done either on a rolling dyno or out at the track. And I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, I want to make it to an open test day. That was a week ago. We didn't even get close. But we've had all of our efforts towards trying to get this car finished and out on track. Because if you haven't figured it out yet, we're trying to get this thing ready for GRIDLIFE South Carolina. That's April 10th through 12th. We have our work cut out for us because we want this thing to be competition ready. We don't want to go out and break it immediately. And that's also kind of why we've been behind on episodes lately. We have been thrashing on this thing to get it finished. And we're going to keep thrashing until we get there. So bear with us. We're still filming everything. We've still got episodes coming. But right now it's all hands on deck so that we can have this thing ready for GRIDLIFE South Carolina. And I hope to see you guys there.